now we have more than enough time for a fruitful discussion. Please, your colleagues, the floor is now yours. Please.
I have a question for John-Paul and Tamara. It's about disability and identity. So I wonder, how was the disability frame expressed, both from disabled soldiers as well as those who are raising money, especially in connection with concepts like victimhood or heroism? If you can tell something about it.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And unfortunately, this is one of the areas where the sources are less eloquent and less that they have less to say about this. When we started this project, I had hoped that we'd learn a lot actually about disability and war in the second half of the 19th century in the Habsburg Empire. But it turns out that there's very little of that in these sources. There's certainly nothing from the disabled men themselves. We don't hear their voices in these sources, but what we do hear are articulations of, as you say, sorrow, pity, victimhood, understood not only as people who were killed in this conflict, soldiers who were killed, but also those who in some sense were maimed. Now, I was quite surprised by that, but I have to say that I didn't have a huge amount of knowledge about disability in this period going forwards, but I didn't expect there to be so much sensitivity and so much understanding, that there is a sort of sense that there will need, that there's a sense of kind of the social model of disability, that there will need to be some kind of social care and social support, and that this will be an ongoing thing. And there's also this trope of visibility and invisibility, which of course, as you know, Martina, is very prominent in war disability after the First World War. So there's an article when people give money. For example, let's come back to this soldier who says, himself not disabled, but he says, I want to give 10 forints of my pension every month or every year for as long as it lasts, because it's important not only that we support these people, but that we continue to support them going forwards. And he means this in two ways. And it makes this very clear in his letter to the committee, to the trust. It means that first of all we need to create some sort of monument. We mustn't let this be an ephemeral thing. We have to establish a sort of permanent memory of the people who sacrificed for the empire in 1848 and 1849. But he's also articulating an awareness that disability is an ongoing issue. That social care and social provision will be required not just on a one-off basis, but it will be required continually. And to some extent, that's the government logic of the trust. That's the sort of that's the germinative spirit behind the whole thing. That there needs to be cash, there needs to be social support for these people going forward. But of course, not just that, but also for their families, not exactly disabled, but the widows and the orphans of men who were killed. Croat men who were killed in these conflicts.
Yeah, just 2 to 3 sentences. I mean, when we are having in mind how some comparable associations try to collect money, they're using strong images on poor children and so on and so on. And when I went through the media reporting about what's going on, what the associations are doing, I expected a bit more about personal stories of, I don't know, a poor widow with her children and what the fund has done to her. But what I found nothing about that. I mean, we had only a look at the initial layers, so the initial stray, so maybe it comes up later. But the only thing they highlighted all the time was to highlight who donated how much. And what we also is still left open in our research is because I'm pretty sure that a lot of people who come up with their names and are so proud about donating, supporting the fund, had supported as liberals the revolution and maybe want to, whitewash themselves. Or it's just something in our minds, so we're not sure about that. But it was super highlighting only the donors.
Thank you.
I have a question for Robert. I enjoyed your debate very much, and I was wondering, Danube mythology has been very popular in the last decades, following the footsteps of Magris and Claudio Magris. Do you integrate this a little bit into your narrative? Or
not really. Magris does a very literary, critical look and isn't really engaging in the types of sources that I wanted to look at. I think it's very interesting, but a lot of what's been done I find to be, it's not using archival sources to make arguments about how daily life is affected by these processes. So I mentioned it in my historiography in the beginning chapter, and that's about it. But I think it is interesting to see that there is this precedent. And in fact, the Danube itself is not, as you mentioned, a new category of analysis. And in fact, in Vienna right now, it's interesting for the past decade and a half, environmental historians have also begun discussing sort of the impact of the Danube on daily life, people who were trying to engage in these processes of regulation or not. But as I was mentioning to someone before, that it ends at the border of Austria and Hungary. So the Austrian historians, although I'm working with them, actually one of them, Martin Schmidt, can read Hungarian, told me, because of his grandmother, but they don't really address the Hungarian sources. And so in a way, it kind of falls into the same categories of national. I mean, despite the fact that environmental history is a great way to look at trans-regional histories, they kind of fall into the trap of these are the sources they can look at. And that's the sort of twist or turn that I'm trying to.
But in a way, your findings could serve to falsify some myths about it.
So you're in terms of how national historiographies have looked at the Danube? Yes, that's possible, but I think that it's interesting because at least in the Hungarian half of the empire, even though you have the Danube as such a prominent river, the Tisza is sort of the Hungarian river because it starts in Hungary and ends in Hungary. And so in a way, what this is, I mean, it's perhaps trying to revise that the Danube is not an unimportant river for the Hungarians as well, and in fact for daily life, for, you know, in Budapest, which is on the river, and in Vienna, the two imperial capitals or royal imperial capitals after 1867, you have already, just in those two places, 4 million people living along the river, and then all these other provincial capitals and small communities where, in a way, I'm trying to bring a little bit of the imperial and the local together, and that's the narrative that I'm approaching with this question of identities and loyalties, this idea of where are people addressing their complaints and concerns, who are they appealing to, which authorities listen or don't listen, and what other groups in society are instrumental in helping affect changes that local communities want.
I was also thinking about biographical myths. I think the great Hungarian Orientalist Vambari is said, allegedly he was born in Danube Island, or there's also Franz Liszt. There's a lot of Franz Liszt legends.
Yeah, playing for the concert of 1838.
And of course this is pre-regulation, and probably there's a lot of mythology involved.
I will work on that for my next project.
Yes, please. The last one. You were the first.
Thank you so much. I have a question to share. Thank you for the very inspiring presentation. I have been interested in your
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Sorry. Could you probably elaborate a bit more on how identities were addressed in the public discourse in the press and when identity was referred to? So I would be very interested in this.
If you want to add something, or maybe on Croatia. So what was really surprising for me, and I also was trapped in this kind of narrative of, yeah, Lajit is a Croat hero, and so on. So I was desperately looking for that in the German. So I did not only had a look on the Viennese press, but German speaking and also Hungarian press and so on. And it was only Gesamtstadt, the unified empire. And so the only identity in the end I detected was not national ones, or what later became nationalities or nations, but it was the Gesamtstadt, the unified empire, and again something which is some kind of supranational whatsoever, the Grenze, the Granichary identity. So when identity was discussed, it was about where the imperial subjects or something like this, and Grenze.
Yes, please. Thank you.
So, to pick up on this, you mentioned briefly the comparison with other organisations, and I wonder if maybe talking a bit more about few other groups talk about the Grenfell. And Paul, kind of like, what about the distribution of the money once they've got it in? And does the distribution to certain groups affect future distribution, future donations? Do we see people saying, well look, all that money is going to Group X, so I don't want my money going to Group X, so I'm not going to donate any more. And very quick point for all, have you looked at the stuff that's being done at the University of Utrecht on the lower Danube, the Romanian part of Danube? There's a big project there, Constantine Ardeleanu is working on that. And that will give you again a third kind of part of the story. I mean, you know, for a future project.
What are in Romanian?
I think it's in English.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I'll very quickly respond to those points. The first of your points, Dan, well, I bring it on, really. I would love to hear more about these other invalid funds, and I would love to have to see comparative work. And I don't know of any, actually. Perhaps I'm really embarrassing myself if people have written about this. How if anyone knows about any of these? Please let me know if you know somebody's working on them, even if you know simply where the sources are based. So plaintively, I would ask, please, if anyone knows about these, but comparison would be fascinating. And on the second point about distribution, also fascinating. Unfortunately, we have to be clear that the side of the story we know from the sources that we've looked at only talks about money coming in. The donations don't go directly, this is an important point, they don't go directly to the disabled veterans or their families. This is a principal sum of capital which is inviolate and which is then loaned out to third parties at an interest rate of 5%, and this 5% interest kicks back to the disabled veterans, if that makes sense. This is strongly worded actually in the sources. This money is not directly for the, no one's touched this money. We always have this basic capital, this principal, which will accrue interest and will also, of course, be used to sort of garner loans. But the second part of the story, which is arguably even more fascinating, about who gets this money. Absolutely. I mean, then you've got questions of hierarchies of sacrifice. Are there sort of deserving disabled and undeserving disabled? Does it mean you have to fall on the right side during this conflict? These are questions that come up after every single conflict in any single context. Who's entitled to social benefits? Who's entitled to that? Who pays? All of these sorts of things. But we haven't managed to sort of find the sources, and they're not
Sorry, just to step in. I mean, the only thing we found was this, and again, it was this, we did not expect that, this concurrence between the Schulz Association and the Jelačić Trust in Zagreb. So, because without this, this struggle, there would have been only really boring announcement of which event they organize and when and who donated what. But this made it some kind of open, because they really addressed it directly, what they think of each other and who is doing better or worse. And what we found is that Schulz, initially the Zagreb branch, only wanted to support the Graničani, the Grenza. And Schulz came up with, what about the poor Croats who came from Dalmatia and supported, were also soldiers, they were also widows. And I don't know, it's so far I've found only the discussions of how Schulz explained it. So that he failed somehow when he said, please also include the Croats, but some kind of silently, our association in Zagreb started to support also the Croats. But it was not them who came up with that initially, seemingly. I would, same for Paul. I wasn't familiar that there was such a kind of flourishing of so many associations collecting money for the same thing, sometimes for the same people. And but what I figured out soon, and maybe this is also one of the reasons, and this was our initial idea, why the Jelačić Trust became so successful and long-lasting in the end. A lot of other associations which came up did not survive that long. was that the Wiener Zeitung, so the most important newspaper, soon started to support the Zagreb Association and dropped Schulz totally. He always complained that he's totally ignored. And also that the Wiener Zeitung started to support the generals associations. And they, so that there was the Winkelstrasse, the Mammen, and so on, and the Zagreb branch and not Schulz Jelatic Association. Interestingly, maybe this was some kind of personal knowledge of Metel Ošegović, who was from the Zagreb branch, the main organizer in Vienna, and there was some kind of personal friendship with some journalist and editor of the Wiener Zeitung. So it's again. The other thing is that Schulz never managed to become officially recognized Landesfonds, which means you don't have to pay for taxes, you don't have to pay for the correspondence and everything. But the Zagreb branch very soon managed to become labeled as a Landesfonds, officially recognized one.
Just really quickly to address Dan's question as well. I actually had a whole chapter addressing diplomacy of the Danube and looking at the lower Danube and how the Habsburg Empire and after 1867 how the Habsburgs and Hungarians attempted to sort of project their diplomacy on the lower Danube. Also in the earlier periods when you have not only the sort of Russian taking over the Delta in 1829 but also the internationalization of the Danube in 1856. And I realized that it was kind of focusing more on this sort of imperial level of, I do look at questions of imperial dynastic presentation on the river for domestic audiences, the reason that I only don't have, or I kind of removed that chapter about the Danube Delta or the lower Danube is because in a way it started to get away from what I was trying to look at in terms of imperial cohesion. And although there are obviously interests in the empire that want to clear the lower Danube, especially Széchenyi in the 1830s and these efforts for the Hungarians to develop their national interests with the opening of this trade route to the Constantinople and Ottoman Empire, that could be a whole other project because that really is another issue of how to transform what was kind of a natural boundary along the river, the rapids, the iron gates between the Ottoman and the Habsburg Empire. And so that becomes this international question of, okay, who's interested in regulating that? What imperial powers, like the French and the British, become interested in and invested in clearing this path as well so that they can take charge of Danube commerce as well after 1856, and that kind of spiraled out of control. So.
Question for Igor. You mentioned that the political views of Isaac Schneider were not really representative for the intellectual scene in Zagreb in the last quarter of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But he was not alone. Could you tell us more about the people you worked with? There was a group of few people who shared this view to a certain extent, and maybe about this pan-imperial network of such people who, as you said, were formed in Vienna during their studies and so on.
Okay, so his, political tutor was one of the previous ministers of education and religious affairs, Ivan Mončina. So basically when Ban Cohen-Hederveli arrived to Croatia, he didn't have a group of administration loyal to him, so he managed to pick up various dissidents and make, let's say, his group of trusted people. And Ivan Mončina, if I remember correctly, he was disappointed at one point in the compromise question or something, and then he was a dissident, and then he soon gained power, and then he introduced Christianity to this new world. But in general, Krishnyavi, although he was a member of 3 political parties and he was connected with various groups of people, he was he had his own individual worldview that was, but he was always like siding with people with whom he thought he had bigger chances to come to some political decision-making position. And the other part of the question, the people, the network of people with whom he cooperated outside Croatia, Mostly it was various historians or art historians throughout the Habsburg monarchy. For example, there are a few letters preserved of him communicating with his professor, former professor Rudolf von Eichelberger. Then also he was good with this newer generation of art historians in Vienna, like Alois Riegel, and also he was in the contact with Bollinger, but he was in contact because he had completely opposite worldviews. And then also he was in contact with, in general, like Central European historians after he started dealing with medieval history. So he sent them his reprint of the article and then had shorter communications.
But what about people like Hegel and those uni circles that are connected a bit later on?
Yeah, I mean, it was more, let's say, professional correspondence that was closely related to the art history, and I didn't find any, let's say, political connections outside Croatia, beside the really narrow political contact with the group of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So when he was in Croatian Party of Right, sometimes he would go to Vienna or Budapest. There he would meet some officials from military or just political officials, and then there was some kind of contacts, but nothing, let's say, more serious or anything that had a really close possibility of becoming something like, let's say, coming to power or to political power again.
So, what about after 1980? What happened to him?
He was forcefully retired from the university, and he started again doing painting. I think more for like surviving than to say. Yeah, and also he became really religious. So he joined the Third Order of the Franciscans and wrote 2 literate books about Saint Francis. And of course, he was very bitter in like short notes that we can see from his personal collection in the archives.
Thank you. We can take one more question, but that is of course not necessary. Yes, please.
I have a quick question for Tamara and John Paul, which is, what about gender identity? It seems to me that anything that is about veterans has something to do with gender. And then also, not only the veterans or the disabled, because it is a disabled man a man, but, and maybe that wasn't discussed at the time, but also the people giving the money. Do you find, I'm sure you must find individual women on these lists as well. It's probably not discussed, but it would be of interest, I think. And also you mentioned, because you mentioned widows, it was a sort of typical call for. So it seems like that would be another dimension that you could explore in terms of identification.
There was not enough time, to tell you the whole story about what we found out. But it was women were really important because. And again, it was something like a discussion, and it was started by Schulz, because Schulz tended to call in the beginning the Vienna branch of the Zagreb Association as this damned institution run by Croat noble ladies who have palace, want to be important and in public. And really, it was initially who founded or started with the idea of that branch, and please correct me if I'm not right. It was a couple of Croat noble ladies. I mean, with 2 names. One is French, one is Croat, one is Hungarian, one is Croat, and with different kinds of spellings of that. I mean, different kinds of spellings was really a crucial thing when working with keywords and the newspapers. And I don't know, 15 versions of Jelačić. And the same for the ladies' names. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I think we were both clamoring for the microphone to say the same things. So the initial outburst outburst of activity was sort of almost organized by Jelačić, yes, but also by these noble women. And this comes from time and time again, particularly in the public, the press and the announcements in the newspapers and this kind of thing. So here you have quite a common trope of disability, which is the women as caregivers. And this comes up time and time again. And I suspect that this could be followed through. We have a few suggestive intimations in the sources, but we don't have anything properly substantial at this stage. But gender is always, I think, underlying disability. It's the case of this time. And this goes either if you're talking about disability in public or in private. So it's women who are collecting money for men to sort of, to kind of, if their social care is needed for them. But even when people decide, okay, actually, there are certain kinds of disability, maybe blindness or these sorts of things, which can be dealt with in the private sphere. This is usually a euphemistic way of the state saying, we don't have the money for this, so let somebody else deal with it. But there's also a hidden gender implication here, because when they talk about disabled men being cared for in the private sphere, they're actually imagining this burden on the shoulders, of course, of women who will look after that. So there's also a hidden gender dimension to disability and to caregiving of disabled men there as well. But the traditional notion, the traditional mode of women being caregivers and sort of supporting men is everywhere. And then there is also disability as compromised masculinity, less manly, feminizing, and this is something which you can also read in the sources.
Yes. Just last short question, and sorry I can't resist not to pick that horse. So I want to ask you, do you think this is your small case study is one of the examples that for nationalism the literacy was not so important, because on your example, based on your example, you could be a part of the national movement in the mid-19th century just if you worked and had money, so you could participate in the Jelačić Fund.
I do, also actually when I was listening to your paper, I found that there's common ground between the sort of dissipated and disseminated sense of nation that you were talking about, how it doesn't reside in an elite group or a single group, but actually in the nation itself, and sort of rural genius or something like this, and come through in these naive artworks about, I understood you correctly. So there seems to be the discourse of central periphery is also operative here as well. Here we have an imperial center mobilizing spontaneously in support of the center. So I think there's the capitalist crossroads.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I think that we really should finish now. After all, it's lunchtime. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, listeners.